So in this sequence of videos, we're going to focus on when if occurs in the middle of a sentence, and that happens when you have P if Q. It also happens when you have P only if Q. Notice so far we've only had if occur at the beginning of a sentence of the form if P then Q. So the question is, how does P if Q and how does P only if Q relate to if P then Q, the one that you're familiar with? We'll also talk about P unless Q either in this video or the next one. So let's start with P if Q. So here's an example. Joe is guilty if he committed the crime. And I want you to think about what that means. So Joe is guilty if he committed the crime. Well, if you think about it, hopefully you'll see that it just means the same thing as if Joe committed the crime, then he's guilty. So these are synonymous. So if we have Joe is guilty assigned P and he committed the crime assigned Q, and we do the same thing down here, Joe committed the crime is assigned Q and he's guilty is assigned P, well, we know we'd represent this one, if he committed the crime then he's guilty, as Q arrow P. And since Joe is guilty if he committed the crime says the same thing as if he committed the crime then he's guilty, we would also represent Joe is guilty if he committed the crime as Q arrow P. Remember contraposition. If Joe isn't guilty, then he didn't commit the crime. So that's not P, because remember P is guilty. So not P is not guilty. And didn't commit the crime is not Q, because committed the crime is Q. So that gets not P, then not Q. So P if Q, Q arrow P, and not P arrow not Q all say the same thing. So if you're going to represent P if Q using the arrow, you would represent it like this, Q arrow P. Of course, you could also represent it not P arrow not Q, since Q arrow P and not P arrow not Q say the same thing. So P if Q is the same as if Q then P, which is the same as if not P then not Q. All right, now let's look at only if. So sometimes we have preceding the word if or somewhere else in the sentence only, as in Joe is guilty only if he committed the crime, or you might say Joe is only guilty if he committed the crime. Either of those is the same. So let's think about what Joe is guilty only if he committed the crime means. Well, it means that the only way he could be guilty is by having committed the crime. It doesn't necessarily mean that he is guilty if he committed the crime. Maybe he had some excuse for committing a crime. It just means that the only way he could possibly be guilty is if he committed the crime. So this is equivalent to if he is guilty, then he committed the crime. Because Joe is only guilty if he committed the crime. So if there's any way he's guilty, it's because he committed the crime. And that's equivalent to if he didn't commit the crime, then he's not guilty, because it's the only way he could be guilty is by having committed the crime. So if we assign he committed the crime Q and he is guilty P, and we have there he is guilty, we'll get P again, and he committed the crime, we'll get Q again, and we'll just have he didn't commit the crime and he's not guilty. And obviously there should be a not here, so I'm just going to add the not real quick. There we go. So P only if Q is equivalent to P arrow Q. Why? Because Joe is guilty only if he committed the crime. That's the only way he could be guilty. Is equivalent to if he is guilty, then it's because he committed the crime. And if he's guilty, then he committed the crime is P arrow Q, which means since these two are equivalent, Joe is guilty only if he committed the crime must also be P arrow Q. And of course, since P arrow Q is equivalent to not Q then not P, you can represent it either of those ways. So P only if Q says that P will be true only if Q is true. That's the only way you can get P to be true, which is the same as saying if P is true, then Q must be too, which is the same as saying if Q is not true, then neither is P. So P only if Q means P arrow Q, which is not Q arrow not P. Now remember P if Q, when you don't have the only, means Q arrow P. So P if Q and P only if Q don't mean the same thing. P only if Q means P arrow Q. P if Q means Q arrow P. So if we put those together, we get P if and only if Q. So P only if Q means P arrow Q. P if Q means Q arrow P. So if we say P if and only if Q, we just mean both of those things. We just mean, because we're saying P only if Q, we mean P arrow Q. And because we're saying P if Q, we also mean Q arrow P. So P if and only if Q means the arrow goes in both directions. Okay, now that's all just how it works. In case you're not feeling it in your bones, in case it doesn't quite seem right to you, I want to now give an explanation that will hopefully help it seem right to you. So this is to pump your intuitions. So let's look at the sentence, X is a sister only if X is a sibling. Does that seem right? Does that seem true? If I say, look, that person is a sister only if they're a sibling, does that seem to be correct? What about this one? X is a sibling only if X is a sister. That person's a sibling only if they're a sister. Does that seem right? Well, hopefully the first one seems right and the second one seems wrong. Let's think about the second one. If I say X is a sibling only if X is a sister, I'm saying there's no other way for X to be a sibling other than by being a sister. But surely that's wrong because there is another way to be a sibling, which is to be a brother. In contrast, if I say X is a sister only if X is a sibling, I'm saying, look, if you're a sister, then you gotta be a sibling, which is true. So the one on the left is true, and the one on the right is false. Okay? Now let's look at another pair. If X is a sister, then X is a sibling. We've seen this example lots of times before, and you can see that it's true, right? If someone's a sister, then they're a sibling. In contrast, if X is a sibling, then X is a sister is false. Because that says if you're a sibling, then you're automatically a sister, but that's not true, because you could also be a brother. So the one on the left is true, and the one on the right is false. And now we can see something important, but we'll come back to it in a second. So what about if X isn't a sibling, then X isn't a sister? I want you to think about whether that's true. And if X isn't a sister, then X isn't a sibling. I want you to think about whether that's true. So let's start this time on the right. If X isn't a sister, then X isn't a sibling. Is that true? Well, it's not true. Because take me, for example. It's true that I'm not a sister, but it's false that I'm not a sibling, because I'm a brother. In contrast, if X isn't a sibling, then X isn't a sister is true. Because that says, look, if you're not a sibling, you can't be a sister, which of course is right, because in order to be a sister, you have to be a sibling. So that one's true, and the one on the right is false. Let's do one more pair. X is a sibling if X is a sister. And I want you to think about whether that's true. And X is a sister if X is a sibling. I want you to think about whether that's true. Well, let's start on the left this time. X is a sibling if X is a sister. Well, that's right, because it says you got to be a sibling if you're a sister, which is true. So that's true. What about the one on the right? X is a sister if X is a sibling. Well, that's saying that if you're a sibling, you've got to be a sister. It's saying, look, you are a sister if you're a sibling. But that's not right, because I'm a sibling and I'm not a sister. So that one's false. Okay, so why are we going through these as true and false? Well, let's think about this. We assign P and Q. X is a sister is P, and X is a sibling is Q. We're going to keep that assignment throughout. So we would represent this sentence P arrow Q. Now let's look at the first one. X is a sister P, X is a sibling Q. How are we going to represent that? Well, the second one here is true. The first one here is true. So they must be saying the same thing. So we have to represent them the same way. So since the second one is clearly P arrow Q, that means the first one must be P arrow Q. In contrast over here, the false ones, that can't be P arrow Q because that would come out true, right? It means it says the same thing as this, which is true. So it's got to be Q arrow P. And same with the second one there. Then we come down to the bottom one. X is a sibling if X is a sister. Well, we said that was true. So it's got to be represented the same way as the first two. So it's got to be P arrow Q. In contrast, over here, this one's false, so it's got to be Q arrow P. And then you can see X isn't a sibling, then X isn't a sister, has got to be not Q then not P, because that's equivalent to P arrow Q by contraposition. And if X isn't a sister, then X isn't a sibling. It's got to be not P arrow not Q, since that's equivalent to Q arrow P. So they come out the same truth value. Okay, so that's the intuition. We'll stop this video there, and in the next video we'll talk about the word unless.